So a lot of you out there have asked about carb cycling, what it is, why it works, and how to do it. It's quite a big subject, it's quite a complicated subject, but what I'm going to try and do in the next couple of minutes is break it down, really simplify it, and give you the idiot's guide to carb cycling. Now, I really like carb cycling. It's an incredible way of getting clients, getting trainees very lean whilst building a lot of muscle, or at the very least maintaining muscle in the later stages of a diet. It can also be a very easy way to diet with regards to your hunger and appetite when done correctly, but providing you have a good baseline of compliance. Anyway, so without further ado, I'm going to go through the very basic premise, almost too basic. I have simplified this very much to try and get my point across to you, but take it with a pinch of salt. This is how carb cycling works. First of all, what is carb cycling? Carb cycling are planned fluctuations in dietary carbohydrate intake. This means that you are not just randomly having a shitload of carbs on certain days. It means that based on your energy expenditure, your need for glucose, day after day, that we are potentially going to increase the amount of planned dietary carbohydrates. And this does mean that they are often tracked or programmed into your diet as opposed to just going crazy and eating everything you want to eat. A higher carb day will usually be on a highly challenging or high volume training day. As I say, it's going to be dependent on the amount of glucose that your body needs at any given time. So on our heavy training days, let's say for instance, a really easy example is a leg day, we are going to be using a considerable amount more glucose on a leg training day or a full body training day than we will on an arms day. Therefore, our need for carbohydrates is greater and we will potentially have a higher carb day. Our medium carb days, if you decide to go with medium carb days, will usually be on moderately challenging or moderate volume days. So for instance, if you were doing the kind of old, slightly outdated body part splits, for instance, so legs, back and arms, we have legs, high carb, back and chest, relatively big muscles, medium carb, arm, low carb, okay? Because the need for glucose is going to be very different dependent on the amount of exercise you're doing. Low carb days will usually be on low volume or rest days, okay? This is usually how we would set out a carb cycle. It's the easiest way to do it, simplest way to teach you the best way to carb cycle. Why is it effective? First of all, it allows for rapid fat loss while maintaining or even increasing muscle tissue despite being in a calorie deficit. I'll explain a little bit more on how that works later. But we need to be in a calorie deficit in order to lose fat. But what we want to try and do is maximize the anabolic hormones throughout a calorie deficit style diet, something that is trying to get fat off us. If we increase our anabolic hormones, we are going to, at the very least, preserve muscle, and fingers crossed, if we get everything right, including recovery, stimulus, etc., we can even build muscle, which is kind of the holy grail, building muscle whilst on a fat loss diet. The calorie deficit deals with the fat loss while the macros deal with anabolism. Now, that's not necessarily science, this is my experience, this is what I've seen work time after time, and for those of you who follow my Instagram profile, those of you on LiveUP, any of the above, you are going to see that the proof is kind of in the pudding. You've gained muscle, you've dropped a ton of fat, and those of you who have carb cycle will attest to how effective it is. The intermittent carb fluctuations when carb cycling help to stimulate anabolic hormones such as insulin on a regular basis. Now, insulin is the key that unlocks the muscle cell to shuttle nutrients in there and helps you build muscle, helps refuel the muscle very quickly. Carbohydrates help to stimulate the release of insulin, so they are necessary for that. If insulin is low, you're really going to struggle to build a lot of muscle because the cells simply can't uptake nutrients. The intermittent carb fluctuations also keep catabolic hormones such as cortisol and glucagon low, preventing muscle tissue breakdown. Now, when cortisol is elevated, cortisol is your stress hormone that can come from very many places. It can be emotional stress, physical stress, overtraining, dietary stress, any of these things. When that is high, it's trying to burn through tissue quite often, especially when it's chronically high. Insulin and cortisol have an inverse relationship. So when one is high, the other is low. So what we are doing when we are taking intermittent high carb days is we are spiking insulin up, which is pushing our stress hormone cortisol down, which is preventing cortisol catabolizing muscle, or the processes that are going ahead whilst cortisol is high from catabolizing muscles. This is very positive, because after a sustained period of time in a large calorie deficit, there's a good chance that cortisol is going to start to rise, and you're going to burn as much muscle as you do fat. By carb cycling and intermittently spiking insulin, you can bring cortisol back down. So to put that into something very visual, and as I say, this is extremely simplified, we can look at this. If you were to imagine a linear diet, a diet without carb cycling, what we see is calorie maintenance at the top here. So if we imagine this top line would be our calorie maintenance. For argument's sake here and simplicity, I've put 3,000 calories. Now, if we want to go on an aggressive fat loss diet, we drop down to 2,000 calories. So let's say this is our planned deficit for a really, really aggressive bout of fat loss. 2,000 calories, it's this red line here, okay? Now, what happens when we remove this 1,000 calories to aggressively lose fat is over a few days, in this case, just for simplicity, it may be a couple of weeks, our body's metabolism, our metabolic output starts to slow down, and eventually it will meet what we're giving it. When it feels like it's not getting any food, it will slow its metabolic processes down. The body is very, very clever. It will slow its metabolic processes down to meet whatever you're giving it. Now, if we were to consider all of this blue area here, between our maintenance and our deficit, theoretically in all of this space you are losing fat, okay? But once we hit this point where our metabolism has dropped to the same level as our deficit, eventually this levels out and we're no longer going to be burning fat. This is where you hit plateaus. Now the thing with carb cycling is that what we can do is manipulate the macronutrients and calories through periods of spiking. So we start at the same spot, 3,000 calories. Our planned deficit is 2,000 calories, and the same thing is going to occur. So over time, it could be a matter of days, it could be a matter of weeks, our body is going to start to down-regulate its metabolic processes in order to meet the food that we are giving it. But before it gets there, before we stop burning fat, we spike carbohydrates and calories. By spiking carbohydrates and calories, we're going to stimulate the thyroid, we're going to stimulate metabolic output, we are going to refuel the muscles with glucose in order to fuel training. Okay, so we're increasing calories and we're increasing carbohydrates intermittently to make sure we never level out and we never hit that point where our body plateaus. Okay, so as you can see, before we get there, we spike up, let it come down, spike up, and in theory, as I said, this is grossly simplified, you're losing fat all of the time. Certain times losing more than others, but in theory, you're losing fat all of the time. In a nutshell, that is how carb cycling works. Now, the same applies on a greater scale with refeeds, planned refeeds. Exactly the same thing's happening. We're waiting for your body to slow down its metabolic processes, but not quite stop burning fat. And then we spike, we give you a ton of calories, ton of carbohydrates usually, to bring yourself back up to maintenance. Your metabolic processes are burning at maintenance calories again before we allow them to taper back down, but again before we stop completely, we spike back up. So carb cycling and refeeding are essentially manipulating a very, very similar principle. They are just appropriate at slightly different times. So what happens on high carb training days? Carbs are stimulatory to the thyroid, so the metabolic processes will up-regulate. This prevents plateaus and it will increase resting energy expenditure. Okay, so we're spiking back up to our maintenance calories, which is helping our body then burn that amount of calories for the next couple of days, hopefully. Insulin is higher because we've had a lot of carbohydrates, so circulating insulin is higher, which is going to shuttle more nutrients and amino acids into the muscle, increasing muscle protein synthesis and your ability to burn, or at the very least preserve muscle, dependent on what your goal is and where you are in your diet. Leptin is also increased. Now, leptin is a hormone that basically tells you whether you are hungry or not. And then when you've gone through long periods of dieting or you've been losing a lot of fat, leptin starts to get a little bit out of control. It can make your appetite go absolutely crazy. And usually the quickest way to shut that down is a big, controlled and very well-timed dose of carbohydrates. So leptin is spiked, which is going to, obviously at this stage, if carb cycling is done correctly, can really help you to control your appetite as well. Very, very useful. Cortisol is low, our stress hormones are low, so we're feeling better, we're not feeling as anxious, we're not breaking down muscle tissue, we don't have the general negative effects of circulating cortisol or chronically elevated cortisol. Because we are taking in carbohydrates and stimulating the release of insulin, that is pushing cortisol down. We are also likely to improve our levels of serotonin, our feel-good hormone, our sleepy hormone, which is going to mean we are going to recover better, therefore building more muscle, therefore building more fat. You see how all of these things start to become very, very beneficial. Low cortisol also improves your mood, sleep, general recovery, all resulting in a greater amount of fat loss and muscle gain. So you see, carb cycling, when done correctly, can be very, very beneficial. The same applies to controlled refeeds when done right. What happens on your low carb or non-training days? Despite a lower calorie intake, your body is still burning calories at a far higher level because the day before, you spiked back up to maintenance calories, or you stimulated your thyroid with an excess of carbohydrates, etc., etc., etc. You've refueled, so your training intensity is probably considerably higher. There are many, many benefits, you see. Insulin is lower, allowing for greater energy expenditure from stored fat. So in theory, on the lower carb days and lower calorie days, as I say, you're burning more fat on those days. Leptin levels are also starting to come back down, which has an effect. When leptin and insulin are low, your body's going to be able to burn more fat, which is a very, very beneficial effect. So essentially, if we were to summarize what carb cycling is and what it does, is it helps you to maximize anabolism, your ability to build muscle, whilst also maximizing your ability to burn fat. And the two are done at exactly the same time. Very, very beneficial, right? The holy grail of body recomposition. And this is why we use it so regularly. This is why it's so very, very effective. For those out there who say you can't build muscle in a calorie deficit, you can't build muscle and burn fat, you are wrong. Because when you do things like this, when you can carb cycle correctly and you get everything right, you can. However, as with everything, there are always caveats. Your considerations that need to be taken into account when carb cycling. Are you lean enough to start with? Because if you are not lean enough, the chances are your body is not going to use carbohydrates correctly on your higher carb days. For various reasons, which are a whole other video, you need to be lean enough in order to start carb cycling. Now, I would usually start carb cycling males in the region of 12 to 15%, depending on how much muscle tissue they're carrying. Females, somewhere in the region of 14 to 18%, I would start carb cycling them. Until that point, I would do a relatively linear diet where the protein is the same, the carbs are roughly the same, and I fluctuate the calories and bring them down on a taper. When I start to get towards the lower levels of body fat and potentially can foresee a plateau, that's when I will introduce carb cycling for people. And that's usually where it's going to work best, because if you're not already lean, you're not necessarily going to use sugars, carbohydrates properly. How is your basic dietary compliance? This is another thing that you need to take into account when thinking about carb cycling or doing things like refeeds, because if your dietary compliance is shit, if you can't get the basics right, carb cycling can be quite complicated to track, manage, and plan. So if you're fucking up on a really, really simple linear way of dieting, then carb cycling might not be the one for you. Really, really simple. You have to earn it. You have to show me, if you were my client, you have to show me that you can earn the right to carb cycle. Carb cycling can get complicated, so if you aren't organized, it may not be a great idea. As I say, it takes a lot of planning, a lot of preparation. You may have to track for a little while to make sure you're getting things bang on. Now, within the LiveUP plan, we do a really, really simplified way of carb cycling. When I originally designed the plan, we designed it in such a way that carb cycling can be done with absolute ease. But if you are planning your own, it can get a little bit tiresome. How complex do you need to carb cycle based on your training split? Now, this goes back to what I said earlier about the high, low, and medium carb days. I always favor bigger full body style sessions as opposed to body part splits. So what I tend to do with carb cycling is I don't usually do a low, medium, and high day. I will do a low day and a high day, and that is going to be dictated by whether you are training or not. Really, really simple. I don't like to give people too many things to think about, because the fact of the matter is, if it's too complicated, most people fuck it up, or if it's too complicated, it overwhelms people and they aren't able to execute it properly. So from my point of view, I prefer doing just a high day or a low day, and I usually train people with full body splits, which I find are most beneficial for fat loss. So that's how I tend to work it, and that's what I advise you do. Really, really simple until you've got the hang of it, and then by all means you can start adding in high days, low days, medium days, however you want to work it. Are you carb cycling for mass or fat loss? This is going to dictate how aggressively you carb cycle, because obviously if you are carb cycling for fat loss, we need to sustain an overall calorie deficit in order to get the fat off. So carb cycles, you may have to alternate between high carb days where you bring the fats down and low carb days when you bring the fats up, but to sustain a particular level of calories. Whereas, for instance, if I was carb cycling for a mass gain, I wouldn't necessarily do anything at all to the fats. I would probably leave the protein and the fats exactly the same and just intermittently spike carbohydrates up and down. Why? Because we want to be in a calorie surplus at times in order to put on mass. We want you eating as much as possible, within reason, remaining lean, remaining in a good hormonal state to gain muscle tissue. But we can have more calories to play with, so there's no need to remove one thing to put another in, whereas when you're on a fat loss diet, you may need to remove some fats to put some more carbs in, okay? Very, 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 very simplified way of carb cycling, or explaining carb cycling. So do take it with a little bit, just a pinch of salt, but that's basically how it works. If you have any questions, drop them in the comments box below, because I will happily do my best to answer them. And if I need to add an extra video onto it, I will. But that is carb cycling in a nutshell. If you found it helpful, tag your friends, tag someone who you think might want to use it. And of course, UP Fitness Live, at UP Fitness Live, go and follow me if you don't already, do all of the above, and of course come and join the squad in LiveUP. This will be going straight into the LiveUP forums for my boys and girls, because those were the ones who asked for it, but obviously it's going to be very, very helpful for you guys too. So fingers crossed you enjoyed it. Carb cycling in a nutshell. Done.